I want to go right to a professor at Hillsdale College who is currently teaching a course on the American frontier. He's also the author of In Defense of Andrew Jackson, among other books. Professor Brad Birzer. Professor, how are you, sir?
Mike, I'm doing great. Just got out of 2 classes. Everything's going well. It's a beautiful day here in Michigan as we're recording this. So yeah, I can't complain. And thanks for having me. It means a lot.
Tremendous, yeah. And I'd love to be taking your course. Maybe give us a little preview of this course that you're teaching right now about the frontier. What's the main thing you want your students to take away as it relates to Native Americans? What do we need to know?
Well, there are a lot of different things. So the main thrust of the course is really trying to figure out what happens when the American Indian encounters the American or the European white man, and not just whites, but blacks and Asians and so forth. You've got this incredible ethnic mixing in the American West, very cosmopolitan cities like San Francisco or even Houston, which isn't exactly the American West, but a very cosmopolitan city, a mixing of so many different ethnic groups. And what happens, I think, Mike, and I think what's always a little bit challenging for students is that we see that almost every single people in the world, it doesn't matter if we're talking about Southeast Asians or we're talking about Northern Europeans or even escaped slaves, almost every single people in the world benefited from the settlement of the American frontier, with, of course, the extremely important exception of the American Indian, who just really had the tarnation knocked out of him. And it's a difficult thing to study, because it's hard to find any gray in it. Not that the Indians were perfect. They most certainly were not by any means. They could be very brutal. They could be very violent with one another. They warred with one another all the time. But certainly when you look at what Americans did to the American Indians, it's a difficult situation, definitely.
I couldn't fathom being back then from either perspective and seeing such different peoples, right? Like imagine you're a Native American and you see this giant ship come your way. It's like, what in the world is happening here? And then you get here and you see this totally different culture in front of you. You're like, what? So how do these two people even pretend, of course they speak different languages too, but how do these people even pretend to relate to each other in any way?
It's a great question, and they do relate to one another, which is astounding. I mean, absolutely astounding that they're able to figure each other out. So you get someone like Christopher Columbus, our first great explorer, who comes over from Spain. He's an Italian, of course, but coming over from Spain. And when Christopher Columbus arrives, he arrives in what's now the Caribbean, and he finds that the Indians there are naked. And what a shock to him, because, of course, the only people who are naked are Adam and Eve before the fall. And so one of the great questions that Columbus has to ask, and it's a question that will be debated in European universities really for the next 40 years, is the question of what is the American Indian? Are they somehow unfallen humans? Are they animals? Are they humans just like Europeans are? This becomes a great question. And interestingly enough, it was one of the good popes at the time. There were a lot of bad popes at this moment in history, but it was one of the good popes, Pope Paul III, who in 1537 issued a declaration saying, at this point, Indians are human beings capable of salvation and capable of free will. So that, I guess, Mike, when you ask, how do we deal with one another? Those were open questions. And the Indians were just as fascinated about the Europeans as the Europeans were about the Indians. I also love examples. Oh, go ahead, Mike. I'm sorry.
Please go ahead. I just want to emphasize the fact that, like, one of the initial questions is, are these people human? Like, that's like a foundational thing that we had to debate for decades. Which is just amazing.
It doesn't get more foundational than that, right?
Yeah.
Like as foundational as it gets.
But as you were.
All right. You can see why there would be confusion, especially because of, again, the nudity that you saw in the Caribbean. That was just shocking to the Europeans that they would see that. And they had no real cultural framework. But the other thing I was going to mention, Mike, before I interrupted you, but you look at someone like the French, and the French explorers who come over, they had great relations with the Indians. They always had great relations with the Indians. The moment French ships showed up in places like Rhode Island, the Rhode Island Indians, the natives there, rushed out to the ships and were utterly fascinated by these white men with beards. And the first thing they wanted to do was trade with them. And so that's an important part of the story as well. It's not always warfare. Quite often it's trade, and people recognize that, my gosh, there's a lot that we can give to each other. So even if we jump forward in history for a moment, you think about something like the Oregon Trail. Many people on the Oregon Trail died of disease. They died of accidental gunshots. They died of drowning. But nowhere on the list of, say, the top 10 is being killed by Indians. And that's because the Indians recognize these are people they could trade with. So that's an important part of the story as well.
Okay, well, that's interesting too, because listen, there's a lot of revisionist history going on in our universities, not Hillsdale, but the rest. So then there's this natural pushback against it too, right? So we hear all this stuff about stolen land. I've heard it my whole life about stolen land. Is there truth that, sure, some was stolen, but is it also some was traded or some was bought and some was legal? How do we make sense of that?
Yeah, it was both. It was all of that above. There's definitely stolen land. There's definitely land that's won through warfare, which would have been considered legitimate even by the Indians at the time, because it would have been a mutual actor against a mutual actor. There would have been something, to use a very non-politically correct term, it would have been very manly to be able to do that. So you get a figure like Daniel Boone, was certainly one of the most interesting figures in American history. And when he's able to wrestle land from the Shawnee Indians in Kentucky, the Shawnee aren't happy about it, but they accept it. They've lost. And so there's a sense of equality in the way that they demonstrate against one another as well. But there are examples where we blatantly, that is we whites, blatantly took land from the Indian. We stole it from them. We did so through very legal means at times, but there's no question that we took it from them. There are other cases. One of my favorite examples, there was a Miami chief. Miami's have nothing to do with Florida. They're located in Indiana and northern Ohio and Michigan. I don't understand why the name is the same as Miami, Ohio, of Miami, Florida, but the Miamis are different. But there was a great chief there who, as soon as the treaties started, he said, fine, we'll negotiate treaties, but we're going to do it individually. Every Indian member of my tribe gets to negotiate his own property. And so we're not doing it as a tribe, we're doing it individually. So you had figures like that as well who really figured out the system right away and understood that, my gosh, these Americans really respect property rights. That's how we're going to fight them. We're going to fight them in the courts. Oh, wow. And they did it.
Interesting. Trail of Tears. So I can read books about Andrew
Sure.
Jackson. All we're told about the Trail of Tears is just bad. Just bad. And I don't know anything about it. All I know is bad. And I haven't even been curious enough, and I'm ashamed of this, but I haven't even been curious enough to be like, well, what was even the genesis of that? What was the excuse given at the time for the Trail of Tears? What do we need to know to give us a full understanding of it?
Yeah, great question, Mike. And it's a difficult answer. Not a happy one, but a difficult one. So in the 1820s, there had been an attempt to take a number of American Indians and voluntarily remove them, if they were from the northern part of the United States, to remove them to Kansas, if they were from the southern part of the United States, to remove them to Oklahoma. And so a number of tribes did actually leave on their own without being forced to. We call these the old settlers, who end up going to Kansas and mostly to Oklahoma, but do go early on. Then Andrew Jackson, as president, when he comes into the presidency in 1829, he makes a great statement, not great as in good, but important statement, that the Indians who live in the eastern part of the United States are absolutely threatened by the violence of their white neighbors. And Jackson, believe it or not, at the time is an absolute moderate on this issue. And he says, and he makes the case to Congress, and Congress agrees with it. They pass what's called the Indian Removal Act. Congress goes along with Andrew Jackson, and they decide that they should remove all American Indians from the East to Kansas and to Oklahoma. And so there were actually some good intentions in all of this because they were trying to get the Indians out of harm's way. It was not purely a land grab. It could become a land grab, don't get me wrong. And there were people who definitely took advantage in an immoral, unethical way. But there were also a lot of good intentions. The terrible part, Mike, and this is where you just see bureaucratic ineptitude. When the Indians were forcibly removed, they were removed, for example, the Choctaws were removed before the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears actually happens under Martin Van Buren, but there were earlier Trail of Tears prior to that. So under Andrew Jackson, the Choctaws, one of the major tribes in the South, was removed forcibly. And they were removed in the winter. And when they started off leaving from the American South, they had a population of about 18,000. 6,000 of those died on the trail out west. And then when they got to Oklahoma, none of the supplies that the U.S. government had promised them to build winter structures and so forth, none of them were waiting there. And so another 6,000 died. So you starting out with 18,000 Choctaw, and a year later, there are only 6,000 left. That, by any measure, that's horrific, absolutely horrific. So it's not that the intentions were bad, but the enactment of those intentions was absolutely horrible. Plus, when the Indians get out to Oklahoma, many Americans said, oh, well, you've got the red men of the East will meet the red men of Oklahoma, and they'll be brothers. Well, that doesn't happen at all. The Comanche look at these Choctaws and Cherokees, and they see white men. They don't see fellow Indians to help them as their brothers. So it's a bad situation all around.
Fellow invaders. All right, listen, I hate those. An entire college course should be dedicated to this, Professor. And I'm glad you're teaching. And unfortunately, we only have 10 minutes. I hope this inspires people to learn more, to read more. In Defense of Andrew Jackson is the name of the specific book here. Brad Birzer, professor at Hillsdale College. Professor, great to talk to you, sir. Thank you very much.
Always an honor, Mike. I hope we get to do it again.